My name is Riley. I'm behalf of YIMBY. I'd like to thank you for being here.
The sun is burning off the window right behind you.
How about over here? Okay, great. Okay, yes, great. I'd like you for being here and just tell you very briefly what Seattle YIMBY is about, in case you don't know. Seattle YIMBY is working towards a Seattle where everyone in every neighborhood can find safe, stable, quality housing at a price point they can afford no matter their means. We believe generally that the housing shortage can be best solved by kind of the most obvious means, building more homes. So if you'd like to help us get there, please consider joining us. We have information at that table back there. You can join our mailing list. You have information about membership as well. That's also at seattleymby.org or the line. And finally, if you're able, please consider donating to help us put on more events just like this one. And that's all I have to say for tonight. Thank you so much for being here and enjoying.
I think you're small enough I could just use my voice and try and carry. I'm Kerry Westerbeck. Thank you for the introduction, Milo. Who has read the book so far? A few of you, okay. Instead of coming up on so you can correct us as we go. Nolan Gray is a professional city planner with experience working on the front lines of zoning policy in New York City. Affiliated scholar with Mercatus Center and George Mason University, where he helps to inform state and local policymakers on land use regulation. Gray is currently completing a PhD in urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he serves on the board of the North Westwood Neighborhood Council. PhD done yet?
I think every detail of that has actually changed.
Okay. Maybe I should have said. We should have thought for it. Oops.
Okay.
How about the next part? In addition to this professional planning work, Gray is also widely published. We all know this is true. Writer on the cities and a regular contributor to the popular blog Market Urbanism. His work has appeared in various outlets, including Bloomberg, City Lab, The Atlantic, and Forbes. In addition to this written media, Gray regularly appears on national and local radio, podcasts, and television to discuss city planning issues. He's also the host of a new YouTube series, Pop Culture Urbanism, which is one of the first places I think I saw you.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was fun. So because we have a little less time than we thought we would, we're just going to let Nolan get started.
Sure. Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to stand. We'll do stand-up zoning here. It's an incredible pleasure to be here. Thanks to the University Bookstore. It's good to be in Big Ten country. For anyone who's been following the recent politics. I'm flattered to be here. First time in Seattle, a city that many of us down in California look to for exciting YIMBY happenings. A few months ago, Kerry reached out to me and he says, you guys have solved all of housing affordability in California. Can you please come up to Washington and explain how you did it? So you all are in for a treat. Jokes aside, thanks again to Seattle YIMBY for having me here. It's so important to get involved with groups like that to really affect change in this policy area. So where are we at? I had intended to have slides, but I wanted to abbreviate it and really move the conversation. Where are we at? There are three really concurrent housing crises. The first is a crisis of just home prices. More and more Americans are altogether locked out of homeownership or any form of long-term stable housing. The second crisis is the escalation of rents and rock bottom multifamily vacancy rates in most U.S. cities, putting most renters in a kind of permanently precarious situation where they can't maybe even build the wealth to make a down payment on an increasingly expensive home. And then, of course, a crisis that surrounds us in cities like where I'm coming from, Los Angeles or Seattle, which is the homelessness crisis. We know that homelessness and housing availability are intimately related. There are excellent books on this that I recommend that you read as soon as you buy a few copies of my book. The final aspect of this, I would say, too, is to the extent that we can still build any housing in the U.S., we make it easiest to build the housing that's the most environmentally destructive, which is new greenfield single-family subdivisions where you are going to be completely dependent on a car. Okay, so good news and bad news. This crisis, as I argue in the book, is policy choice. These concurrent crises of housing unaffordability, economic stagnation, racial and economic stratification, and environmental unsustainability, I argue in the book, they have a common shared contributing factor, which is our zoning policies. So who here in the room would consider themselves a zoning expert? Sure. Okay, sorry to hear that. Who here knows maybe generally what zoning is, but they, okay, good. And then who are the happy, normal, well-adjusted people who don't know anything about zoning? Nobody? Okay, there we go, thank you. You might want to leave now. Zoning is kind of everything and nothing, right? I think we commonly treat zoning as synonymous with planning, but planning is something that humans have been doing basically since we started settling down. Zoning, by contrast, is a century-old institution where we sit down and we say, for every single parcel in the city, we're going to designate permitted land uses and the permitted densities at which you can build. Now, most people have kind of a top-level Sim City sort of version of what that's like, right? Industrial, commercial, residential. But if you actually crack open your local zoning code, not that I recommend that you do that for your mental health, it gets far, far, far more detailed. So in your typical US city, for example, as I'll talk about here in a minute, there are incredible distinctions made about the type of residential that can be built in any given part of the city. And there are long, long lists of permitted and prohibited commercial uses. I would also add too, just very quickly, in the first part of the book, I spent a lot of time explaining zoning, and I think the most accessible way I could have. I provide a very brief history of zoning where I think I tried to challenge some of the standard assumptions about, oh, well, we needed zoning to keep, oil refineries away from daycares. A lot nastier of an origin than that. I'll spare some of the details here. But so I want to really focus on the housing affordability piece because I find that that's very much still top of mind for a lot of folks. As I argue in the book, zoning increases housing costs on three ways. The first is by simply altogether making it illegal to build a lot of housing. So in your typical US city, except where, for example, in states like Washington or California, where the states have intervened, it's illegal to build anything other than a detached single-family home in the vast majority of US residential neighborhoods. In your typical city, that's going to be about 75 to 80% of residential parcels. In your typical suburb, they might have a total prohibition on multifamily. In many cases, commercial zones might not allow multifamily or mixed-use housing, where historically commercial zones might have had a mixture of uses, shops, offices, hotels, apartment buildings. Today, we've essentially locked our cities in a straitjacket of land use monoculture, of pods of different daily uses where you will get from one to the other using exclusively a car. The second relationship here between zoning and housing affordability is that in many cases, the zoning rules we have on the books increase the cost of the housing that we do allow to be built. In suburbs and rural areas, one of the really important rules here is minimum lot sizes. So essentially saying that if you can't afford maybe a 5,000, 7,500 half-acre lot, you are not allowed to live here. And you're not allowed to build a home that would be affordable to somebody in that price range. We know that these rules are binding, and we know that they're a major contributor to housing costs. Okay, here's hopefully a crowd pleaser. Do we have any chupistas in the room?
What?
Chupistas? I'm about to tell you. Acolytes of Donald Shoup, famous parking reformer and all-around zoning reform Jedi master. Add that to the book list, the high cost of free parking. In urban context, a similar effect is effectuated by minimum parking requirements, which say that if you want to build maybe an apartment or a townhouse or a store or an office building, you're going to have acres of parking garages. As Donald Shoup would say, and we can all encounter together, there's no such thing as free parking. The costs are hidden in the cost of a unit, and these costs can be fairly substantial. And I'm mainly focused on this talk on housing affordability, but of course this ultimately dilutes the urban realm. It gets you a landscape of surface parking lots that deaden the public realm, of parking garages that do the same, of streets that are congested with traffic, which of course has significant air quality issues. I would add to, if there's any levity to be made out of parking requirements, they're often quite funny. So of course, sometimes they're, based for churches on inches of pew space. For pools, they might often be modified by gallons in the pool. As we know, diving pools, people drive to diving pools, but they don't drive to kiddie pools. This is all very scientific, by the way. Please don't question where these rules came from. And then, of course, my favorite is minimum parking requirements for bars. So literally writing drunk driving into law. The third connection here that I think a lot of folks in this room, if you've been active in YIMBY politics, you're acutely aware of, is, again, for that housing that we do allow, increasingly because our zoning rules are so out of sync with the housing that we need to be building in our communities, almost every new project requires some sort of discretionary relief. It requires some sort of extended review process a process that, as we all know, is easily hijacked by potentially highly unrepresentative groups of homeowners who might be opposed to any and all change in their community to the detriment of future generations of urban residents. We call these people NIMBYs. As I understand, you have quite a few of them up in Seattle. We definitely have a lot of them in Los Angeles. But what you get are these discretionary processes where even in the best of cases, in a city like New York, for example, it's going to take you at least 6 months to get a rezoning that would likely be necessary for almost any new multifamily building. In California, and I'm not entirely sure of the state of the policy here in Washington, this also requires that you undertake environmental review, which in an urban info context, frankly, has almost nothing to do with the environment, but it does open you up to significant new compliance costs and potentially extended litigation. A couple more things that I'll quickly say on this. Collectively, what these rules have done is they've made it hardest to build precisely the types of homes that we need in our communities today, which is starter homes. I know some people don't like that term. You know, frankly, a starter home I'd be perfectly happy with a typical starter home being my lifetime home. But you know, when I talk to policymakers, I'll use that word starter home, and I think they imagine in their head, you know, a 2.5-story bungalow on a 5,000 square foot lot, right? And then conversely, if you show them a picture of maybe a 5/1 multifamily condo building, they'll, you know, be repulsed, like, oh, this is new luxury multifamily that's increasing our housing affordability issues. Of course, you know, in your typical city today, that detached single-family home is going to be priced far out of reach of your typical young family. And that condo building might actually be precisely the unit that lets them get access to stable, decent, affordable housing. That's an important story to tell. I'm focused mainly on housing affordability, but in the book I have chapters on the relationship between economic opportunity and zoning. Of course, the incredibly sordid history of the relationship between zoning and racial and socioeconomic segregation, which I think is an absolutely essential story to tell. I think that was key in why cities like Minneapolis were able to get rid of single-family zoning. And then I talk about the relationship between zoning and long-term environmental sustainability. But if you want to learn about all that, you'll have to buy the book. Okay, is everybody depressed? No? You came here on your Friday night to like hear a crazy guy from LA complain about zoning? No. I have some very good news. As most of you know, we're making incredible progress on this issue. I think there's 3 main paths of reform that really excite me and should excite you too. The first is the way we've structured zoning in this country. Local governments have pretty wide authority to remove a lot of these rules that stand in the way of infill housing and high opportunity areas near jobs. Of course, many local governments are not always going to avail themselves of that opportunity. And that's where I think we're going to be really reliant on state governments setting guardrails around local jurisdictions when they use these powers in an exclusionary way or in a way that harms the long-term environmental or public health of the community. And then I'll talk a little bit about it here, but the last section of the book is really focused on this. I also think there's value in having a much larger conversation about what we want out of land use planning. As I argue in the book, I think we talk a lot about making zoning less bad, and that's what I do in my day-to-day. I think that's extremely valuable work. Getting housing built by any means necessary as quickly as possible at all income levels and high opportunity areas, that's key. And frankly, in the near term, that's going to involve zoning reform. But in the book, I argue it's time for, I think, a reset about how we think about land use planning that actually focuses on the things that really concern people, but without establishing all these institutions that can so easily go off the rails. So local reform. The simplest way that I put it here is at least when we're first starting folks out, is legalize the types of housing that you know your community wants and needs. We've seen a lot of incredible local progress on legalizing what's called missing middle housing. Does anybody know what missing middle housing is? Most people have heard of it by now. So this is essentially low-rise residential housing. If you go to your typical pre-zoning neighborhood in almost every U.S. city, in many cases, it's one of the most desirable neighborhoods if it managed to survive a century of zoning and freeways and urban renewal. And you'll find a mixture of housing typologies. Yes, you'll find single-family homes, but maybe some of those single-family homes have been divided up. That was the type of home that my grandma lived when her and my great-grandma moved to Louisville, Kentucky. They lived in a divided-up old mansion. Subsequently, that divided-up old mansion has been reassembled and put in a historic district where it can no longer ever be subdivided again, but I'll set that aside. But you have single-family homes next to townhouses, next to small multifamily buildings with, God forbid, maybe a corner grocery or a corner barbershop. It's funny because I think when you talk about zoning reform, I think often people imagine something like Manhattan or Hong Kong, or I guess what's the unfashionable city today? It's like Dubai or something, right? It changes every 10 to 15 years as people discover that those cities aren't super scary. But when you actually say, no, what would local zoning reform mean in my community, and you show people a neighborhood that they're intimately familiar with, I think that actually helps folks understand, hey, the rules that we have on the books are preventing good neighborhoods from becoming great neighborhoods, or great neighborhoods from remaining great neighborhoods over time, because you need that incremental change and flexibility. A variety of jurisdictions have made progress on this issue. 2017, by being the first city to remove single-family zoning here in the Pacific Northwest Bend. It's happening in a variety of contexts. I suspect it's going to keep happening more and more often. Many of you probably saw this recently. When I wrote the book, a lot of these reforms were still relatively new. And in fact, I wrote the book in 2020, so we didn't know what was going to happen with a lot of this stuff. There was a piece actually looking back at what's happened in Minneapolis over the past few years. Minneapolis not only removed single-family zoning in 2017, but they also allowed for a lot more mid-rise multifamily on their commercial corridors and near transit. They're one of the only metropolitan areas in the Midwest that's actually building housing significantly at scale. And what we've seen over the last few years is they're one of the only major metropolitan areas in that region that's seen rents fall in real terms. I mean, that's pretty good. A lot of times we hope for rents to stabilize in real terms, right? I think that's been the experience of Auckland so far. Minneapolis went on this tear of building new multifamily housing, frankly, in the best possible places that it could be built, and they're already experiencing the dividends. Cities that are dealing with a housing crisis, as I would say almost every city in America is now, no longer have an excuse for not adopting reforms like that. We've seen what happens when we act on this. A couple other local reforms that excite me, riffing on zoning issues that I've raised previously: minimum lot size reductions. In the book, I talk a lot about Houston as a really fascinating city, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Houston doesn't have zoning, but it has a lot of zoning-like rules. One of those is minimum lot sizes. In 1998, the city dropped minimum lot sizes from 5,000 square feet to 1,400 square feet, essentially allowing 2 or 3 townhouses on every single lot in the city. Looking back over the past 25 years or so now, we know this has helped the city to create 80,000 new townhouses, new housing going in the existing city using existing infrastructure, keeping housing affordability for folks who want to move back into the city, and potentially reducing their BMT, not having to live out on the periphery of the city. So the last thing I'll say about parking requirements, I promise, just get rid of them. It's funny because I think that 5 years ago, it's like, well, let's get rid of them in our downtown, or let's have some like administrative mechanism for, getting projects out of this. I think we're fine to get rid of parking requirements. As they say at the Parking Reform Network, citywide, all uses, right? This is a pretty easy one. 2 more things that local governments can and should do that I think are most exciting. We have to start rebuilding our housing safety net. Of course, that means putting more of the resources into subsidized housing for folks who will never be served, even in a context of housing abundance, without some extra help, but also allowing the most inherently affordable types of housing, things like single room occupancies in cities. These are unglamorous. These are not most people's first choice for housing, but historically they were what kept people from having to live in a tent under an overpass or in their car. And to the extent that cities can allow SROs to be built, once again, it's absolutely key. I would note again, Houston, not an all-purpose city planning model. I think, as I argue in the book, I think it reveals the promises and limitations of zoning reform and abolition. But I would say Houston is the only city that's eliminated veteran homelessness, and the only city that's on track to eliminate overall homelessness, in part because they have housing abundance, but also in part because they allow new single-room occupancies. And as I drive around Los Angeles, or I drive around cities all up and down the West Coast, I find it increasingly indefensible the fact that we make it extremely difficult to build new SROs, and I think most people here would hopefully agree. The least sexy reform that I think is really important is process reform. It's all well and good for housing to be legal. If it takes 6 months to 2 years to get a permit, if it requires a whole bunch of public hearings where crazy people yell at social workers and affordable housing developers who are trying to enrich their community and protect people, it's a dead letter. right? We have to make it extremely easy to build housing, especially of the deed restricted affordable variety, which faces so much community pressure. Of course, as we all know, local governments often will not act, right? So I think the typical story that's happening right now in the US is the core cities are doing relatively well, right? I was just literally this morning gave a talk in Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake City has actually done a lot of these reforms, and a lot of new units are coming online. It's really exciting, but basically every other suburb in the city has done nothing. And most of them are probably never, ever going to do nothing by their own volition. Zoning is a state delegated power to local governments. And when they're misusing that power, or when they're not using it in a way that supports the general welfare, it's appropriate for states to come in and put up guardrails. That, I think, has been one of the really, really exciting things that has happened all up and down the West Coast. I will I will celebrate California. There's not a lot of good housing stories out of California, but looking back over the last decade, I think one of the most exciting things that has happened has been the legalization of accessory dwelling units. So there's a little bit of history. Does anybody know? Everyone knows what an ADU is, accessory dwelling unit? Perfect. Small additional apartments that might go in a garage or an attic or a basement or be a new structure that share a lot with a single family home. These are also known as granny flats or mother-in-law units because folks often rent them to aging parents or relatives or friends or loved ones for $0. A lot of people don't know this. The deep history of ADU reform in California is that in 1982, California says to local governments, pretty please legalize ADUs, but by the way, you can write whatever code you want, and if you really don't want to legalize ADUs, just please write us a book report explaining why your community is special and shouldn't allow these. Anybody want to guess general range how many ADUs were built over that 4-year period? It turns out every community in California is special, and they can't possibly build an ADU. In 2016, the legislature, with a lot of fantastic housing leaders, wised up and said, we're going to set a statewide framework. A good ADU ordinance, frankly, in San Jose is a good ADU ordinance in Torrance, is a good ADU ordinance in pick your California suburb. 2016, they established clear statewide framework for ADUs. Laws come into effect in 2017. And what we've seen is tens of thousands of new units coming online, especially in higher opportunity neighborhoods that were literally illegal to build before 2017. We know that these disproportionately go in higher opportunity areas, in many cases in jurisdictions that hadn't built a single unit in decades. We know that they're, for the most part, rented out. The typical ADU is rented out to a friend or a family member for $0. After that, it's quite common for them to be rented out at slightly below market rates because they're just slightly cheaper, potentially less glamorous units without whatever people like, stainless steel appliances, marble countertops, demonstration kitchen, right? Are those so popular? I always thought that was a weird amenity. So now in a place like Los Angeles, 1 in 4 units permitted last year was an accessory dwelling unit, right? And yeah, some of those might be just used as a guest suite or extra office space. Based on the survey evidence, it doesn't actually seem. It seems like most of them are being rented out, or at some point will potentially be rented out. And those were all homes that were illegal to build until 2017. I mean, that's the power of these reforms. Other things that we've done to varying degrees of success in California, SB 9 legalized duplexes and small lot subdivisions across California. We're still working on that one. It's kind of a game of whack-a-mole. You do something and then every exclusionary jurisdiction finds some way to subvert the law. So if you hear of that, let me know. We're collecting examples, some funny, some maddening. For example, there was a jurisdiction that said you can build a SB 9 duplex, but it has to be LEED Platinum. I don't know that a LEED Platinum duplex has ever been built anywhere on Earth. If you find an example, let me know. A couple of exciting things we've done. AB 2011, which came into effect just a few months ago, legalized mid-rise multifamily on most of our transit corridors. Really important fight this year with, I don't want to jinx it, it's on the governor's desk right now, SB 423, providing significant streamlining for mixed income multifamily. A lot of these laws, they're still coming into effect. We're slowly seeing uptake, but it's trending in the right direction. One of the things that I actually find really exciting about this issue, stepping back and looking more broadly away from California, is that it's not especially ideological or partisan. There's not necessarily a sort of right or left way of interpreting the fact that we just don't have nearly enough housing. Of course, folks might have different ways that they frame the issue. For example, Montana adopted probably one of the most ambitious pro-housing reform packages this year, and they used the language of property rights and deregulation. Concurrently, of course, places like here in Washington or other progressive states like Connecticut, what was top of mind for folks was reckoning with the segregationist intentions of a lot of these rules, or ensuring that we have growth patterns that are environmentally sustainable in the long term. I think sometimes folks on Twitter, you might have heard of that platform, like to pick on each other for not framing this issue in exactly the way they like. But I think that's actually a strength of the movement, that folks from a lot of different backgrounds can see the value in some of these reforms, and that we can build coalitions. There's not too much role for the federal government here, but the federal government, as this crisis goes national, is increasingly paying attention to the issue. In recent years, we've had bills with extremely subtle names like the Yes in My Backyard Act and the Build More Housing Near Transit Act. Does anyone know what that does? Those bills, a few of those bills haven't passed, but a really, really important thing that we did get in a recent spending bill was what's now being called the YIMBY grant program. So the federal government is saying, literally, we are kicking in $85 million in grant funds for jurisdictions that want to remove exclusionary barriers to new housing. I suspect that as the housing crisis deepens, notwithstanding amazing efforts that are being undertaken in states like Washington and what we're up to in California, the federal government is going to play an increasingly active role. And they're increasingly going to say to jurisdictions, hey, if we're going to give you money for a transit stop, we want to see a plan to have housing and mixed income housing near that transit stop. If we're going to give you money for community development block grants or other discretionary funding, we want to see some efforts to make sure that you're actually building your fair share of housing. And I suspect, hopefully, that we'll see more federal support for YIMBY efforts. I'm running a little bit over, so I want to leave time for Q&A. But as far as my big picture thoughts on where we go from land use planning, pick up the book or we can chat about it afterwards. I'm again really grateful to be here. I can see there's a lot of expertise in this room, so I really look forward to the conversation. And thanks again for having me.
All right. Yes. Is this on? There we go. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Nolan for coming here. 2 talks in one day. That's great. So you flew in from Salt Lake and came to us. It's great. All right. Thank you. Well, let's go to your questions in the audience first. I've got a few up my sleeve, but I'm sure you have a few. So I can bring this around, or you can just try and, it's not a very big audience. You can probably get it to us if you'd like. Who's a question? Over here, then Riley next.
So I've been teaching in this subject for 16 years here, and this is the first book I've ever read that tells the truth about this. What prompted you to write this book, in addition to your experience as a planner in New York? How did you intellectually envision the book? Because it's completely brilliant.
Well, I'm really flattered by that, and I really appreciate it. Those experiences were related. I mean, I always kind of had sort of, I'd known, I think, the standard story that most YIMBYs know about zoning, which is, it's making it harder to build some housing here on the margins, it's stopping certain types of housing. But as we called a borough planner in New York, so we were assigned to represent a neighborhood. And just the sheer relentlessness of the farcical situations that you are in under contemporary zoning as a planner wears down on you. You start keeping notes. I mean, just having to tell homeowners on a weekly basis, no, you cannot build an ADU for your mom you want her to move back in with you. Can't do that. Having to tell a small business owner that, this version of my business is not working. I'm thinking about switching over to this, but a lawyer told me I needed to call you all. And having to tell that person, yeah, you need a special permit. You should hire an attorney and start your many thousands of dollar applications. Seeing projects that were precisely what the city needed, mixed income multifamily projects right next to transit stations, be dragged through the coals when the underlying zoning would have allowed for 4 or 5 McMansions to be built on that lot. So that just wears down on you when you do that for enough time. And I actually find that you talk to more experienced planners, and the ones who haven't become totally desensitized, I think, understand that. So I wanted to hopefully just provide a one-stop shop for the critiques of zoning, highlight, I think, some of the exciting reforms that have happened, and then just start the project of thinking through what the next type of land use planning looks like. I feel like there's so many planners who, that potential element of the book, in many ways, it's the most underdeveloped, but I think it's also the most important, and I think of it more as an invitation, inviting folks to say, hey, let's start thinking of this next project. We know that the system that we have today is broken, but what comes next? So thank you again for the kind
Well, I
words.
use your book in my class. I bought many copies on behalf of them. And I again want to thank you. It is completely useful material.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Anybody else want to compliment?
Randy, you had a question next?
Yeah, so you talk a lot about Houston, or a fair amount about Houston in the book. And one of the things you mentioned is this compromise, and you describe it, where in certain areas have deep restrictions. Do I have that roughly right?
Yeah.
I totally understand that compromise. I worry, however, that it preserves maybe the most inequitable parts of the zoning history by saying to the wealthiest, most exclusionary places, oh, well, you can maintain your exclusionary status. How do you think about that? Because in the book, you kind of say, well, this compromise maybe will be worth it for benefits, which are great.
No, fair. Yeah. I mean, I hope it comes through that I'm a little bit sort of, this was the compromise that made it work. We're the one U.S. city that doesn't have zoning. I sort of pick this up when I talk about how were they able to adopt such radical minimum lot size reforms too. And it was the same dynamic. They said, okay, look, if you're really committed to keeping the current rules, you can opt into them. I would say it's a compromise, right? And if we can't live with that compromise, I think it makes sense. I think certainly we need HOA reform, in most states, right? Maybe that's the next book, because people really hate, I think people hate HOAs more than zoning. But that was the compromise that made it work. And I think it was a compromise that, in my opinion, on net has put Houston in a really positive place. The vast majority, yes, there are these pockets of exclusion that folks have voluntarily opted into, but it's not like your typical U.S. city where the local planners have come in and are institutionalizing exclusion on behalf of homeowners. And there's this massive public subsidy, and it's also very hard to opt out of it. So it's a very nuanced case, and I think I mentioned this, but I talk about Houston to really try to reveal the possibilities and limitations. Houston is by no means an all-purpose planning model. They made just about every other planning mistake that could have been made in the 20th century. But to the extent that they didn't adopt zoning, and to the extent that they had a very mild compromise to make that work, I tend to think it was an acceptable compromise that's put the city on a really healthy long-term trajectory. And as they solve some of these other problems, like adopting an amazing bus redesign program, or building out their bicycle infrastructure, or really cracking down on development in flood-prone areas, I think they're in a really healthy place going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to play Phil Donahue, and I'll bring you the microphone so we make sure everyone hears the question.
Okay, so I have a question more about, I guess, commercial zoning reform. So what we're doing with residential is fantastic, and it seems to be picking up pretty quickly, which is great. And I think about like the city of Seattle, we have, I guess, Will, our nice comp plan, duplexes, triplexes, sixplexes in lots of the city. But that's all fantastic. But then you just have dense neighborhoods with nothing to do. And when do we get back to, or I guess, how do we get there with like corner stores that you kind of touch on that, barber shops, this, that, and the other? It just seems like basically legacy home building from, I don't know, late 1800s, early 1900s, where you have a shopkeeper living upstairs and a shop on the first floor. Like how, I don't know, when do we get there? How do we get there? What's your kind of expectations on that front?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks. So I think a few things. One is we're already seeing progress on allowing for more home-based businesses. So this was kind of forced on cities by the pandemic, but historically many U.S. cities had required that if you want to run a home-based business and maybe have like one or two people visit your home a day, or maybe one employee visit your property a day, if you maybe have one person who helps you out. If they allow that at all, which most jurisdictions didn't allow that, it would require a special permit. So it was effectively not allowed. No one's going to pursue a special permit for that use that small. And so what you had, and I would add too, home-based businesses were disproportionately run by folks in caretaker positions, women, folks who historically have been excluded from capital because they didn't have to go and get a loan to have a physical storefront. So there's a significant equity consideration of that. A few states have established laws saying that defining what's called a no-impact home-based business, where they say if there's no measurable impact to the home-based business, the jurisdiction has to allow it. Just as of right, issue the permit, no fees, no permit required. I'm so used to California where issuing the permit promptly is like the dream, right? But so there's been some progress there. A few states have adopted that. The thing that really excites me is legalizing, once again, accessory commercial units. I think that's going to be a huge battle in single family areas. But for example, I live in a neighborhood called Palms in West LA. Anybody familiar with Palms? Okay, the brand is elevating. It's a multifamily area of LA that was built out after. It's kind of famous for its dingbats if you're into architecture. And it's fairly dense, and there's almost no commercial except along the major corridors. And exactly to your point, I look at this neighborhood and I think, well, this is absolutely a neighborhood that could support corner groceries and barbershops. I think you could get there if you allow for things like accessory commercial units, small additional commercial spaces that we allow that are maybe exempt from the FAR, they're exempt from parking requirements, and maybe have some sort of max size and hour of operation rules. But it's going to be a new frontier, I think, for zoning reform. And I believe there was some exciting stuff that happened over the course of the pandemic here in Seattle, right? You had the folks, serving apple cider out of their garage, very Seattle story.
Yonder.
Yeah, so exciting stuff. This is really the next sort of set of issues that we need to work on, because it's all well and good to legalize new dense infill housing, but we need to make sure that there's walkable or bikeable commercial nearby to really minimize VMT.
Someone else?
I could shout. Sure. So in terms of what comes next, and I'm not having read the book, did you do any international comparative analysis on totally different ways of approaching planning and stuff, not knowing other alternatives?
Yeah, absolutely. So, here in the U.S., we love to tell everybody how to do everything, right? I know some of you might remember Pete Buttigieg. They had the DOT best practices in transportation planning, and everyone assumed that we were going to go out and learn from other places, but actually we were going to go out and tell other places how to build infrastructure. We have a lot to learn from other countries on this. In the book, I highlight how Japanese zoning works, and it's different from the U.S. both procedurally and substantively. So process-wise, zoning rules, what we might think of as the zoning text, the list of zoning districts and then the rules that apply to those districts, that's established at the national level, and then local entities map zoning districts. And then the substance of it, in many cases, it's significantly more liberal than American zoning. So even the most restrictive district in Japan will allow potentially low-rise multifamily and some neighborhood-serving commercial. I think that's a useful model. I mean, Japan is, of course, comparative work is tough because, right, every country is very different. But to the extent that we can move more in that direction, I think that would be positive. I think, we're never going to be in a situation where we have national zoning in the U.S., but we could move to a framework, for example, where state-level entity establishes, hey, here are the standard zoning districts in Washington, and then here are the rules that are going to apply. Similar system in France, by the way, which, I find that it's interesting. On the West Coast, people are more interested in the Japan example, and on the East Coast, people are more interested in the France example. But France has a very similar system where there's a significant national involvement in these rules. And it's different from Japanese zoning in that it's much more focused on form than the use of the structure. So all positive examples that we could learn from. I think two more things I'll say on this. We also have great examples coming out of New Zealand, where New Zealand has essentially at a national level gone very YIMBY and allowed for a lot more missing middle housing in most of their residential areas. And there are cities like Auckland that did this early on are already enjoying some of the benefits. A flip side of that is at least we're not the UK. It's probably the worst planning institutions in the world.
We have more questions.
Okay.
Could you go into some more detail on the history between exclusionary zoning and how that relates to redlining and racial segregation writ large? I think most people, when they look at a map of redlining, it's very obvious what's going on there, right? But when they look at an exclusionary zoning map, the connection doesn't always happen there. So I guess really my question is, how do you talk to the layman about that connection and that history to get them to understand?
I mean, I would say the simple answer is the ability to determine what gets built where is the ability to determine who gets to live where, right? So let's step back a little bit. the historical origins of Euclidean zoning, the zoning that applies in most U.S. cities today. A little bit of preface here. In the 19-teens, a whole bunch of U.S. cities, especially cities that were experiencing a lot of migration from the South, adopt explicitly racial zoning. And I don't mean this in the sense that we say zoning is racist today. I mean, they were literally saying blacks can live here and whites can live there, right? Cities like Baltimore, Louisville, St. Louis. In 1917, in a rare moment of clarity on racial issues in this time, the Supreme Court says, okay, guys, that's like too much. You can't do that. I mean, they have a very convoluted justification. They're like, this abridges the rights of white homeowners to sell to black buyers, but yeah, it's fine. The decision's directionally correct, even if the rationale is very weird. But so what you get in the aftermath of that is a scramble for regulatory mechanisms that achieve that same type of segregation, but without ever saying the word race, right? In many jurisdictions, I mean, in Atlanta, you know, you can literally see they're changing their like white and black district to like R1 and R2, right? Like there's a very explicit line here. And so what you get is jurisdictions saying, well, we never say the word, you know, race or white or black or anything, or in the Berkeley context, we never talk about, you know, the Chinese migrants who are running laundromats near us and upsetting our beautiful Anglo sort of bucolic community. But we have rules that achieve essentially the same aim, right? And they're often fairly explicit about it. In the Berkeley case, you can read, you know, city bulletins where they say, like, we need to adopt industrial zoning. And you read that, and with your modern mind, you immediately think, oh yeah, of course, like nobody wants like an oil refinery or like, you know, a tannery moving in on their street. And then it's like, well, what's the example of the industrial use that was upsetting them? And it was Chinese laundries. It was dance halls that were attracting African Americans into the community. So the segregationist intentions here are deeply baked into this, and I think now they manifest themselves more in even a fairly explicit desire for socioeconomic segregation. And you know, in a place like Washington, the NIMBYs are a little bit sophisticated, so they'll tiptoe around that. But your modal planning hearing in the U.S., you propose affordable housing, and you will hear exclusively segregationist arguments against allowing it.
Do you think there's any room for federal action on like a modular building code similar to HUD code for mobile homes?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's also on the list for potential next book is building code reform, but that's scary. Right? No, yeah, I think there's important progress to be made here. As I understand, that's one of the main barriers is that HUD has just not set clear workable standards, and that's true to a certain extent of just all manufactured housing. So yeah, I think there's value here. Since I don't know a lot about that specific issue, I will talk about the building code stuff and just say this again. You know, I think zoning reform is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And we're looking at other barriers to housing. So for example, in California, as I believe in Washington and Oregon this year, we passed bills initiating studies of allowing, for example, single stair point access blocks, which you all already allow them in Seattle, famously. So
statewide this session.
Oh, so we went statewide. Okay, fantastic.
Code Council has to come up with the code by the end of 2026, or excuse me, the beginning of 2026. I believe.
Great. Well, we can't move too quickly on this. That would be dangerous.
Gotta make sure there's some committees.
Yes. Never mind that the entire rest of the world doesn't do it this way.
Yep, exactly. Right here.
Could you talk about economics? We have serious issues. For example, the banks, we've had these goddamn townhouses built because the banks insist on the entire property is owned by the building, so that when they want to foreclose a mortgage, they can foreclose. If they share the land, it's impossible. Banks are insisting on a certain amount of parking underneath multifamilies. Economics, we're finding that things just aren't penciling out the right way. There's absolutely no way in the free market that you can build anything that's affordable to someone at less than 50% of the area median income. Can't be done. We're trying to do something here in Seattle with Initiative 135, but that's going to take 20 years to really accomplish anything at all. I was walking past a condominium building in First Hill yesterday that the advertised that 2 bedrooms for 1.1 million for your condominium plus your monthly fees. There is a single family residence in Wallingford that I walked past today that is 2 bedroom and a very nice 1.5 story building for $850,000, cheaper than the condominium, the brand new condominium.
A couple of different points there. To your first point, I think we do have to do a lot more education with underwriters and the folks who actually build the housing. Point well taken that to the parking issue, for example, even when we remove minimum parking requirements and developers say, I can build a building with fewer parking spaces and produce a cheaper product, the bank says we're not going to underwrite that project. And that's a problem. And I think we have to do more education work. Hopefully, as more projects are able to take the risk and show, hey, look, we built a project with fewer parking spaces and we didn't have any trouble leasing it out. Hopefully, we'll make some progress there. To your sort of second point, I'll say a few things. One, yes, we absolutely need subsidies for deed-restricted affordable housing in the near term. Absolutely. We've, for decades, have been underbuilding, and we've got ourselves deep into a crisis. And even in the best case scenario, it's going to take years before we build our way out of it, right? In the meantime, of course, we can't leave folks in the lurch without access to affordable housing, and that's going to require kicking in the subsidies, creating the incentive program, building the deed-restricted housing. But I will say, even where new luxury units are coming online, we know from increasingly robust filtering research that those new market rate units come online, and they might be expensive. In many cases, they absolutely are. It's certainly true in Los Angeles. But what you have is a chain of moves of the person moving into that unit, triggering a chain of moves that we seem to believe is about 40 to 50% of the time extends all the way down to the bottom of the market. So you're relieving pressure at lower levels of the market and potentially effectively creating more affordable housing in other segments of the market. That's a complex story to tell people. That's the invisible thing. We see the luxury condo, but we don't see potentially the multifamily building that has been, or the multifamily unit that's been vacated 3 or 4 moves away by that chain of moves that's now potentially cheaper because there's just more supply coming online. But that's the truth of it. And to the extent that we can tell that story, I think, that's key.
I don't think you've got statistics to support that.
Well, if you'd like to follow up, I'd be happy to send you the papers.
Filtering, either filtering up or filtering down.
Right, yeah, I think that's
We have
right.
examples here, for example, over across from the zoo on Finney. There's a 16-unit apartment building that is highly affordable. It's going to be torn down to build a 24-unit apartment building that will have rents 2 to 3 times the unit that's being torn down.
Well, I think that's why it's absolutely key that we do the work and legalize more multifamily housing in single-family areas where folks are going to be able to cash out, collect their windfall, and then we get a lot more units on the same property. In California, every single bill that we pass, we have provisions in there that say you can't redevelop any rent-stabilized or rent-controlled building. So we can say in good faith we're not kicking. Even in many cases, these bills actually contain provisions saying you can't even redevelop the property if there's a low-income tenant in it, or if there's been a low-income tenant in it for the past 5 years. So we're very sensitive to that issue, and I think one of the challenges is that we've kind of picked the low-hanging fruit, right? We've allowed ADUs, we've allowed now multifamily on corridors, but then there's still this vast amount of land in most of our U.S. cities where you're not allowed to do anything other than have a single-family home. And it might look humble, but your typical single-family home in a place like Seattle or Los Angeles is now going to be north of $1 million. And if we want to actually add new supply, we're going to have to be frank about the fact that these communities are going to have to incrementally change over time and do their fair share of building additional housing. And those new units that come online, they may not be exactly at the affordability level that we want them to be, but they're going to be new supply coming online that relieves pressure potentially in other parts of the market where units are getting much more affordable. And I'd be happy to follow up about that if you'd like more research there.
Well, our time's up. Hi, everyone. Please join me in thanking Nolan for coming up here. If you haven't read the book, I have. I was eager to get it. I ordered it early, of course, nerd. It's got some pretty exciting solutions, ideas for getting beyond zoning towards the end of the book that I've found really robust and I've been talking about for the last year or so. I encourage you to read. The whole thing here is a really quick read. Nolan's a good writer and very enjoyable to read. So read it, check out the end, and then hopefully I'll see you around the city and we can talk about what you think of those ideas as well. I don't know if you have any closing comments. Before we gave up closing comments, I wanted to say, Milo, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to say to wrap things up.
Yes, so we have books available here behind the register. If you would like, please feel free to come on up, and then I believe Nolan, if you're willing to sign, you can just hang on.
Thank you for coming.